Hello, everyone. This is a call. And what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about, well, basically what I talked about yesterday, which was uh, sex power in the eighth house. I just want to elaborate on that idea. This video is meant to take some of those ideas a little bit deeper. So when we're looking at these concepts around sex and power in the eighth house, and again, I make these associations with the eighth house, but people could say, oh, well, the 12th house is about sex, or the 10th house is about power. Yeah, that could be true, but the dynamics are different. So what we have to kind of look at when we're looking at the eighth house and we're trying to understand dynamics around sex and power is we have to look at where true power comes from, and we can also look at how sex is a transformational tool. So when we're looking at the energies of Scorpio or the eighth house, we're ultimately always looking at the idea of transformation. So that's the process of death and rebirth. And of course, that process is, it's part of nature, so it's unavoidable. Now, when we're examining people who have not issues, but that makes it sound negative, people who have planets in the eighth house, oftentimes you might see a theme, or it's kind of like almost like a tug of war between the material and the spiritual. Now, don't get me wrong, the eighth house, because it is the eighth house out of 12, it's still about because again, on a deep level, the eighth house and Scorpio are still tamasic. What do I mean by tamasic? Tamasic is what they call a guna, and it's basically a fundamental quality that exists in nature. So Scorpio in the eighth house are always ultimately about the material plane. However, the lesson learned in Scorpio, this is a very mature placement. This is a placement in which the recognition that that true power is expressed from the inside out. Other words, a lot of the sort of negative tendencies that sometimes get heaped onto Scorpio natives, controlling, manipulative, all those may be true. However, those qualities are simply what I would consider immature Scorpio. They're attempting to manipulate the external world in order to attain power and energy. Because remember, Scorpio as a sign, it's a feeling, emotive sign. It is ruled by water. So, in other words, their sort of primary driver is still going to be those things which are watery, which are emotions and sex in a lot of ways. And I'm not saying Scorpios are entirely ruled by sex. For all I know, I've known Scorpios who have had no interest in sex. So that's a possibility as well. However, in this particular case, sex has the potential of taking on this different role. That is to provide true power. And I'm going to get into that in a moment. So when we're examining these deeper energies, what ends up happening, again, the realization here is ultimately understood, is that we shine from the inside out. That is the maturity point here. So meaning that, because remember, Pluto, which is the planet of transformation, which is operating deep in the background. This is not a personal planet. This isn't a planet in which we can really kind of recognize what's happening. It's almost like your soul's karma. And that's probably really the best way to describe it. It's kind of like a karma you came into this lifetime with in order to sort of evolve particular energies. And in this particular case, Pluto is operating in the background, forcing individuals who have a lot of placements in the eighth house, sun, moon, it doesn't really matter. These energies, they always kind of play out in various ways, but they're forcing these energies to evolve into a deeper spiritual understanding. But again, it's really about finding the right fuel source is the best way to say it. So they're looking for the right juice, the right fuel. All the energy expended, all the energy wasted trying to manipulate the external world leads to what? Dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction is my key word for Scorpio. I haven't known a single Scorpio who has been like, hey, I'm totally satisfied, unless they were mature and they've had these understandings later in life. There's a restlessness and an anxiousness and a sort of dissatisfaction and that can come across as grumpy. However, those energies, once they realize that I'm going to turn inward, they start to find the true pathways towards power. Now, what are those pathways? Those pathways go back to a simple fact. The body is life, and life has nothing to offer but flow. And that's a quote from Yogi Bhajan. Now, body is life, and life has nothing to offer but flow. The body is life. It is, the sensory experiences of life all flow through the form. And again, the sort of the energies of life flow from the inside out. That's a fact. That's not something you choose, right? So we either choose to recognize that or not. So that is the goal of Scorpio here. And the goal of, and again, what we're here to learn, if you have a lot of placements in the 8th house, is the recognition that, those energies are, again, coming from the inside out. And so as soon as that recognition happens, the interest into the 8th house is also known for hidden things, the occult, right? So the occult. So what is the occult? The occult is astrology. The occult could be human design, if any of you are familiar with that. It's something I teach. The occult could be Tantra, again, something else I teach. Yoga, like Kundalini Yoga, again, something else I teach. I'm kind of promoting myself here in the process. Then it's, again, it's all those things which get you to turn inward. So it's about taking those blinders off, which are fixated on the external world, which was really much the goal of the previous signs. The previous 7 signs. Their focus was much more on the material plane. And again, I'm not saying Scorpio isn't focused on the material plane, but again, this is a mature placement to recognize the true source of power. Again, I'm going to keep saying that because you're not going to see the other expression of power until you get to the 10th house in Capricorn. So in the 10th house in Capricorn, you start looking at power dynamics. That could be your stature in society and things like that. So going back to this idea, what are the pathways into the body? So the pathways into the body, intimacy, yoga, tantra, I mentioned those things before. Anything that's going to get you to, psychology, all these different things are going to get you to sort of like turn inward. And once you turn inward, that's when this sort of refining process occurs. As I perceive it, you can't, Pluto is here to kind of help us refine things. And in the refining process can be a little bit painful. And in the case of Scorpio, again, they're looking at this term, this dissatisfaction. And they're also recognizing that there's a certain self-reliance that has to be ultimately cultivated. The desire here may be about getting money, getting things from the outside world, again, manipulating the outside world, but ultimately, there's a generalization about Scorpio being kind of minimalist. Again, that sort of minimalism, that self-reliance, which are all admirable traits. But again, it's always for the purpose of working through that dissatisfaction and recognizing, again, the root of power. So sex, how can sex help us here? So again, sex is a sensory pathway experience, right? So you get all these sensations, all these feelings, and pleasure is a pathway back into the body. So again, just some of the generalizations that go along with the 8th house in Scorpio, right? So all these things are meant for us to go deeper into the form, to center, to recognize, and this is key, recognize how flow, that would be the universe, infinity, spirit, whatever we want to term it and call it, that doesn't matter. It's that idea that there's something greater driving us, right? So the term I want to look at here is involution. So the turning inward, the recognition of intuition, the recognition of instinct, and how that ultimately drives us out into the material plane for correct action. There's a nakshatra called Jyeshta. I'm might be pronouncing that right or wrong. So in Vedic astrology, they have nakshatras, and these nakshatras are kind of portions of a major astrological sign. So at the end of Scorpio, the last section of Scorpio, you have Jyeshta. Jyeshta is this, it's kind of the ultimate expression of what I'm talking about here. It's this sort of this driven energy that still exists, but it goes deep into the understanding of the dissatisfaction. It goes deep into the understanding that this is really about connecting to flow. And again, it doesn't mean that the material world is bad, and it's not about creating this level of letting go the material plane, because that doesn't really happen until Pisces. So 12th house in Pisces is where you get the ego starts to separate from those things in a way. And I'll probably do a video on that at another time. But this Jyeshta energy, which is ultimately victorious, but it has to like work through so much dissatisfaction. And again, once it gets there though, it doesn't really get a lot of personal satisfaction from anything, because really it's about the process of getting them to understand the true source of power. So going back to this kind of idea about sex centering, so sexual energy is a base foundational energy, and it is a base foundational energy which we choose to steward. We choose to either release or allow to build. So again, there's a choice here, right? So if I'm solely interested in my orgasm and having sex, that it's a bit like saying all my focus is on the material world, so everything is externally focused. So I discharge, I ejaculate, and I leave my energy out into the world. Now, if my focus is internal, it's centered, then what ends up happening is I make that choice to say not ejaculate. The internal pressure and the energy begins to build. Intimacy, we'll use another term here. Intimacy is about, let's say, touch. We'll use touch as the most basic form of intimacy. Not sex necessarily, but closeness, proximity, and touch. So closeness, proximity, and touch, it does what? Helps break down boundaries and barriers. You break down boundaries, barriers, and controls, because a lot of the controls that exist within a human being and within Scorpio are internal. We cut off our own power. We control our own power. So as we learn to recognize those controls, we can let go of the controls and we can surrender. So you surrender, you start to recognize how flow is moving through you using your intuition. So the soul of the 8th house, the soul of Scorpio, is that in a lot of ways like Mars, right? So Mars is a planet that is personal, unlike Pluto. Pluto is, again, kind of a background driver that throws circumstances at you, situations at you, in order to cause transformation. Mars is instinctual energy. It's like what gets a baby to move right at birth? What gets a baby to crawl? The baby's not thinking about moving, right? There's probably no, again, I'm not going to say I can't remember being a baby, but I imagine the cognitive process about crawling, let's say, I don't think they think about it. Oh, I'm going to crawl now. I'm going to put one arm in front of the other arm. I don't think that's a thought process. So Mars is this planet of instinctual energy, right? It's instinctual drive. And so Scorpio is here to refine that instinctual drive, because Scorpio is ruled by 2 planets, Mars and Pluto. The instinctual drive is like autopilot. So they're here to refine that autopilot so that they can then express out onto the material plane, I guess, in a coming from the higher self as opposed to the lower self. And I'm not saying, again, one is better than the other, because, again, ultimately, we're here to understand those things. It's part of what we're here to evolve and do, but it's all good under the sun, right? So we don't really have a choice. We have a preference. but good, bad, negative, positive, it's all part of the big picture of what it is to exist on the material plane. So you need to let go of preference here. And so for those of you who says, oh, I operate from this place or that place, well, now you got pride coming in, you got arrogance coming in, you have all those kinds of qualities, which are, again, sort of expressions of the lower self. So gratitude, just be grateful. You know, whatever challenges you're working through, whatever you're, struggling with, have gratitude, because when you're functioning from the heart, again, connecting back to the body, this is the space of gratitude. When you connect to gratitude, you connect to the heart, you connect to the navigation, you connect to flow. And that's the point. So with all that said, I do astrology charts, human design charts, I do body work, somatic body work, personal trainer, etc., etc. So if there's in some way that you think that I can help you, please reach out. My website is down below. So with all that said, thank you for watching the video.